Okay, let's go a bit deeper into the actual mechanics of selection and how uh, natural selection works. So positive selection refers to when one allele grants a survival advantage over another allele. The degree of selection depends upon the size of the selection coefficient, whereas neutral selection refers to genetic drift, where allele frequencies change as a result of chance. Selection of advantageous traits occurs more readily in larger populations, where the selection coefficient is greater than the force of genetic drift, while in small populations they tend to have selective coefficients smaller than the power of genetic drift, and so advantageous traits may not be selected because the power of genetic drift is overwhelming the power of selection, because the small population size results in a smaller selection coefficient. So we calculate selection by doing 1 minus the relative fitness, and we calculate the relative fitness by basically doing the number of offspring produced multiplied by the survival rate, which is exactly the same as what we did a little while back, where we were talking about 1 second. What we were talking about here, where we were calculating fitness as the number of offspring produced multiplied by the probability of survival. So it's a bit different. Here we're doing the exact same thing to get W, which is the relative fitness. So selection is just 1 minus the relative fitness, which is the exact same thing as what we're talking about in that other one. So basically that means that the more offspring that survive, the higher the relative fitness of the trait, because individuals with that trait are surviving more frequently, which results in a lower selection coefficient, because as W gets greater, S gets smaller. This would mean that selection is weaker as more of the total offspring are surviving, so there is less selective pressure acting on particular traits. Lower survival rates would put more pressure on advantageous traits, and so the force of selection acting on them would be stronger. So basically, smaller populations, So basically, if we're talking about populations with traits with high relative fitness, so a population has high fitness, they're well suited to their environment already, a lot of their offspring are surviving and being able to reproduce. Selection is weaker because these organisms are already well suited to their environment, so they're all producing a lot of offspring, and then a lot of those offspring are surviving, whereas if relative fitness was lower and there were lower survival rates, then fewer offspring are surviving to maturity, so only offspring with adaptations to kind of overcome whatever problem is killing them are able to survive and reproduce, and so those alleles associated with these surviving organisms are going to be selected. So with regards to drift as the null hypothesis, detecting selection is difficult because we use drift as the null hypothesis. So that basically means we presume that a trait is the result of genetic drift unless that we can prove statistically that there's a statistically significant correlation between the trait that we're observing and the survival probability. It's also true that a change in allele frequency, loss of diversity, and population divergence can be products of drift. So to determine whether traits have evolved by positive selection, you must also assess whether allele frequencies are fluctuating above background levels of variation expected from genetic drift. So the effective population size, NE, is the size of an ideal hermaphroditic population that would show the observed amount of drift. Typically different to the census population size, which doesn't account for age reproduction. That doesn't account for age of reproduction for mating systems, for population structure, for sex ratio, or for non-random mating. So the census population size is kind of an aggregate that doesn't consider these details. Effective population size accounts for these age reproduction, mating systems, population structure, sex ratio, non-random mating. A low effective population size results in a loss of genetic variation, as neutral alleles are liable to become fixed via genetic drift. This can lead to problems, as lower effective population sizes also mean high probability of inbreeding, which reduces the genetic variance or heterozygosity of offspring. Low genetic variance produces less robust offspring, and populations tend to decline and become extinct. So there are a few examples that I put on the right here, like the pygmy mammoths, which were a species of mammoth. I think that might be wrong. I think the example I'm thinking of is the Mediterranean elephant, and they became geographically isolated on an island. They had extremely high levels of inbreeding because of the low effective population size, so they eventually became less robust. They had less heterozygosity, they had fewer alleles, so they were less able to adapt to change. And obviously deleterious alleles accumulate, like we're going to talk about next, with high levels of inbreeding, so they eventually went extinct. We had a similar problem with a species of snake on the island of Anglesey, just off the shore of Bangor, with the Anglesey adders, who had a very low effective population size, and more offspring were being stillborn, and the population was declining. So we used this kind of the new genetic methods to kind of study this, to know what's going on, and we decided to incorporate a population of German blackadders to the island of Anglesey to interbreed with the local Anglesey adders, increasing their genetic variation, increasing heterozygosity, and reintroducing alleles that had been lost through genetic drift, resulting in certain alleles becoming fixed, increasing the general heterozygosity of the native population on Anglesey, and it's proved to be a pretty effective conservation program. The population has rebounded, and the German blackadders were taken out of the population, and now we just have our Anglesey adders and the progeny that they produced with the blackadders. You also have the example of the Isle Royale wolves, who were a group of wolves who made it to an island. They were isolated. They lived there for many years, but because there were very few wolves who colonized the island in the first place, they were all extremely inbred, and now I believe they are just about to go extinct, with the remaining two being a father and his daughter/sister, and they're the last two actually on the island. and they're probably going to